Washington, I'm Greta Van Susteren. This week, a look at 40 years of diplomacy, the landmark agreement in 1979 that surprised the world and normalized diplomatic relations between the United States and China. An agreement that would signal China's entry onto the global stage and pave the way for China's spectacular economic growth. But where does the relationship stand 40 years later? And is that relationship between the United States and China stable or rocky? And what can we expect to see in the next 40 years or even the next year? Plugged In will bring you an exclusive interview with the 39th United States President, Jimmy Carter, who negotiated and signed that historic deal in 1979 that normalized relations with China. He shares his recollections of that historic agreement, and we will speak to experts and VOA reporters about current tensions and what is next for these two economic superpowers. We're live on Facebook at Voice America, and we would love to hear your comments and your questions. But before we get to my interview with former United States President Jimmy Carter, we want to give our viewers a sneak peek of a documentary that VOA's Mandarin service has been hard at work preparing to mark this historic anniversary of the start of formal U.S.-China diplomatic relations. Here is the official trailer showing the evolving relationship between the world's two biggest economies and how the U.S. and China arrived at this moment in history. Take a look.
The meeting between the leaders of China and the United States is to seek the normalization of relations between the two countries.
The United States of America and the People's Republic of China.
For the U.S., it was painful to have to switch relations.
It's certainly the case that we oversold the
what was not
political benefit.
What it could have meant was that the United States
China needs to look in the mirror and ask itself.
In fact, we are in a rivalry position.
I mean, the most significant change is the relative power.
China has chosen economic aggression.
China's market distortions and the way they deal cannot be tolerated.
Joining us to talk about that historic 1979 agreement and how it helped shape China's entry onto the world stage, we are joined by VOA Mandarin Service correspondent Yinan Wang, who helped produce that documentary. Nice to see you.
Great to see you, Greta.
Okay, so tell me, how did the establishment of that 1979 agreement, normalizing relations between these two huge nations, how did that change the trajectory of China?
I think on the by the late 1970s, China was trying to change the gear. They want to opening up their economy. They want to open up to the whole world. I think there's another geopolitical factor between the U.S. and China. That is Soviet Union. That is common threat to the two countries. So at the late 1970s, the Cultural Revolution was over. So the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping wanted to opening up the economy to engage with the outside world. So I think that's one of the main factor was to improve the relationship with the United States. And after that, I think we see a whole new China today. The China now today is world #2 economy, and some people say it's the second superpower next to the United States.
So what are the challenges today then?
I think the challenge today is the United States and China. A lot of people say their relationship is in an inflection point, that we will see a continual downturn. One of the problem is the ongoing trade conflict between the U.S. and China, and then there are other reasons. There are other things going on. The geopolitical rivalry in South China Sea and East China Sea, and we have seen a lot of competition, rivalry between the two nations.
Do you think both nations' expectations back in 1979, when that historic agreement was signed, do you think that the expectations of both nations have been met?
Some people say they agree, some people don't agree. I think, from my point of view, I think at that time, the United States and China wanted to deal with the Soviet Union. I think certainly that goal was met. But after that, after the Cold War, and we have seen the continuing growing of the Chinese economy, and there are new problems come out. So we have to deal with the new situations.
As this agreement is being worked out, and President Jimmy Carter signed it, but it sort of dates back a little bit to President Nixon making a historic trip to China, was this, the Soviet Union wasn't part of this at all. They were surprised by this, were they not?
They are surprised. I think most of the experts would say it was a matter of convenience between the U.S. and China. But certainly, Soviet Union was a factor. It was the Soviet Union, the common thread, that pushed the two countries closer and closer.
And what about Taiwan, though?
Taiwan was a sticking point during the negotiation, and actually our team interviewed former U.S. ambassador to China, Stapleton Roy, and he was a person at the negotiation table with the Chinese back to 1979, summer of 1978, and it was a very memorable talking by Ambassador Roy. I remember very vividly. It was a surprise to a lot of us. It was he told us in the summer, in August or July, when the negotiation was going on, and at some point, it was almost fell apart because the United States wanted to continue arms sale to Taiwan, and China didn't really want to do that. And then,
not at all. Not at all. All right, so this documentary, before I go, two quick questions. Where is it going? Where can people see it, and when can people begin to see this documentary?
We hope to air it very soon. We're 95% done, and I hope we can get it aired very quickly.
Well, this is certainly, it's a historic time. What a perfect time for this documentary. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To put U.S.-China relations into perspective, here's a brief timeline from Plugged In's Mil Arcega on the 30 years before this historic 1979 agreement.
The year is 1949. Communist Party leader Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China after defeating the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, who fled with his troops to Taiwan. The U.S., which had backed the Taiwanese nationalists against invading Japanese forces during the Second World War, were seen as meddlers, leading to decades of limited U.S. relations with mainland China. A year later, in 1950, the Korean War breaks out as Soviet-backed North Koreans invade the South. China sides with the Communist North as U.S., UN, and South Korean troops approach the Chinese border. By the time the three-year conflict ends, 4 million people are dead. In 1964, China launches its first atomic bomb test as U.S. Sino tensions are escalating in Vietnam. But by 1969, disagreements between the Chinese and the former Soviet Union fuel violent border clashes between the two communist countries. And very soon, Moscow would replace Washington as China's biggest threat. In 1971, ping-pong diplomacy, China's invitation to the U.S. team to compete in the mainland, helps thaw relations between the two countries, paving the way in 1972 for President Richard Nixon's historic 8-day visit to China. Which brings us to 1979, when U.S. President Jimmy Carter grants full diplomatic recognition to China, inviting Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping to the White House and officially acknowledging the Chinese mainland's One China policy.
And that, of course, is where we begin with my interview with former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Mr. President, it's been 40 years since the United States has had normalized relations with China. That was when you became president, a hugely significant time in history. Why did you do that?
Well, I decided to do that before I was president. And I didn't know how to do it because it was always a big problem with the status of Taiwan in China. But we finally worked that out harmoniously. Deng Xiaoping and I did. And we had been through terrible wars in the Pacific. You know, I had been in the Navy, in a submarine when we had a war with the whole world, World War II, and also during the Korean War I was in the Pacific. And we saw the ravages of Vietnam. So there was a constant series of wars in the Pacific in which we were involved, including the one between China and Japan, where we were on China's side. So I wanted to bring peace, and since 1949 there hasn't been any wars in the Pacific. I think part of the result of that is because of good relations between the United States and China. I think it was probably the most long-term significant thing that I did when I was in the White House, was to normalize diplomatic relations with China after 30 years of conflict. We got to be real good friends. We admired each other. I visited him when he was almost my age in China. And I would say that he carried out his commitment of openness and reform to a very high degree of completion in China. They still have a way to go in human rights, but they've made tremendous progress. And so the relationship between the United States and China is now and will continue to be for a long time the most important bilateral relationship, I think, in the world.
I don't think younger people, younger than I, realize what a big moment in history that was. And there's a lot of pushback from the Republicans, the Taiwan lobby, and you were, as I understand it, you began the negotiations almost secretly.
Well, we did, and I got a labor leader to represent me because I wanted to be a tough negotiator, and a lot of people in the State Department were against it. So we never sent a dispatch to our representative in China from the State Department. All of them went from the White House to China and back to the White House instead of, we just bypassed the State Department.
And no one knew?
No one knew. And of course the Secretary of State knew, and Dr. Brzezinski knew, and a few of us, but it was very close to held secret. And the big altercation was about what to do with Taiwan, because after Nixon went to China in 1972 and had the so-called Shanghai Communique, which declared there was just one China, he refused to say which China, and we continued to say that Taiwan was the only China, and President Ford did the same thing. So I was determined to change that.
What was the reaction after the normalization was January 1st, 1979,
right.
And then a few months later, of course, you signed the Taiwan Relations Act, which protected Taiwan. But after the relations were normalized, did Taiwan contact you?
Very negatively. My Deputy Secretary of State went over to China, to Taiwan, and he was physically attacked on the street by irate Taiwanese. But I think the Taiwan Act that we got through the House and Senate of the United States successfully, as you said, protected the interest of Taiwan, it protected the interest of the United States. And we had a provision in the relationship, the treaty between the United States and Taiwan to warrant to allow for a 1-year notice. So I gave Taiwan the notice that a year from then we would have normal relationships with China and not Taiwan. And so we continued our commercial relationships. Another promise that we made was we would not sell, offensive weapons to Taiwan with the potential of attacking China from Taiwan. That's been, well, I adhere to that commitment completely, but some of my successors in office, I won't say which ones, maybe departed a little bit from that.
What was Deng Xiaoping like?
I think the secret to the quick acceptance of a new Chinese-U.S. relationship by the American public was due entirely to the character and the good humor and the down-to-earth nature of Deng Xiaoping. He was an instant hit with people in Washington, D.C., and then the rest of the world through the news media. He wore a cowboy hat in Texas, and he went visit Atlanta at my request. And so I think that that his personal characteristic of a good-natured, down-to-earth, honest dealing guy came across to the American public as, okay, China must be all right, instead of evil people like we thought before.
What was the Soviet Union, what was their response? Because as they see that you and Deng Xiaoping are friends and we've got normalization relations, what about the Soviet Union?
They were quite irate and attacked us through diplomatic means, complained quite bitterly, and said that we were lining up, that the United States and China would gang up against the Soviet Union. But I finally calmed them down, including Brezhnev, who was the president of the Soviet Union, and we got along fairly well with both of our previous adversaries after that.
Anyone know that the Soviet Union would break up 12 years later? As that was happening, the United States and China built its relationship into one that dominates global trade. It also created a trade deficit between the two nations that was becoming unmanageable, leading to the trade tensions we're now seeing. Now, given that backdrop and the growing friction between the two countries, how is China marking the 40-year anniversary? More on that from VOA international correspondent Bill Ide in Beijing.
The 40-year anniversary of U.S.-China relations was a fairly low-key event here in Beijing. It could have been a moment for celebration or an opportunity to reflect on how far the relationship has come. But it has clearly been overshadowed by trade frictions between the world's two biggest economies. And not just that, it is also unclear where the relationship is heading. The anniversary that has been given much more focus here by the party and the media has been the 40th anniversary of so-called reform and opening up. Of course, if you're talking about reform and opening up 4 decades later, something clearly is not happening. And that is the crux of the growing China problem that analysts and officials are debating, from Washington, D.C. to Canada and Europe and across Asia. Beijing sees itself as having earned a seat at the table because of reforms it has carried out. Millions have lifted themselves out of poverty, and it is increasingly demanding that its voice be heard. But its rejection of international and universal standards of human rights at home, basic political rights for its citizens, and increasing use of social controls with the help of technology have put its proposed role as a responsible stakeholder in doubt. Some are advocating decoupling and tighter scrutiny of Chinese investments, technology export controls, and people-to-people exchanges. But in a recent interview, China's ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai, said that is unrealistic. All of those connections, he said, are part of the bridge between the two countries, one that he noted is now a bridge over troubled water. Back to you in Washington, Greta.
Okay, so bridging these troubled waters, China's rising influence and the growing economic rivalry between the two countries is the starting point for part 2 of my interview with President Jimmy Carter. So fast forward to now. I mean, you changed the whole course of history in terms of normalization of relations. Now we have the China, which has footprints all over the world with its Silk Road Initiative. It's got trade all over the world. It's got it's in our backyard in Nicaragua. It's building a military base, perhaps in the South China Sea. I mean, what do you think of China now?
Well, what Deng Xiaoping promised the Chinese people, the world, and the United States, and me personally, was openness and reform. And they have had tremendous reform within China. There was zero free enterprise in China before that, and after that, China's become a very dynamic, open society as far as commerce and trade is concerned. And they have several billionaires now that have made a profit, whereas before '79, no profit was permitted by anybody in China. When I was visited China the year after we normalized relations, it was completely impossible for a person to move from a small village to a big city or vice versa without getting personal approval from the Communist Party. That's all been done away with. Before normalization, there was zero Christianity in China, either Protestantism or Catholicism. And Deng Xiaoping, at my personal request, passed a law of complete equality of worship.
No Bibles, though.
And there were no Bibles before that, but now the number one producer of Bibles in the world is a Chinese company that prints Bibles, and they're free to distribute it in China. The one thing I asked him for was missionaries to be permitted back into China like they were before we broke up with China, and he said no to that, but because he didn't want missionaries to come in and do what he claimed they did early on, and that was to be superior to the Chinese people and to change the Chinese culture. So he said no to missionaries, but my other 2 requests, Bibles freely distributed and freedom of religion, he passed that bill.
So how do you reconcile today? I mean, let's take, for instance, the Uyghurs. Yeah. Some say it's ethnic cleansing. They're put in re-education camps, and they don't have the religious freedom. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, although China has made great progress in human rights, as I've just mentioned, with the Uyghurs, that's a very sad blight, I think, on the world picture of equal treatment for people. And there's still some problems in China which they're trying to overcome. China has not had a war since 1979, and we've spent trillions of dollars on our own wars in Iraq and so forth. So I would say that they've done a tremendous job in their own country, not only of building up their infrastructure to an admirable state of quality, but they've also almost completely eliminated extreme poverty in China. And I think in a year or two, Xi Jinping, the president, is going to announce that they've ended poverty for all Chinese people, which is a wonderful achievement. So I think they've spent their tremendous financial resources very wisely, whereas we've squandered much of our financial resources on unnecessary wars, in my opinion.
All right, we bring up finances. The current president of the United States has a trade war. He has tariffs on China. I take it that would not be the Carter diplomacy with China.
No, it wouldn't.
I thought so.
And I think since the summit meeting that we had in Argentina, I think they've made some progress. China has agreed to do 2 or 3 things. One is to buy more soybeans. And I think they've made 2 purchases of a major size of American soybeans. They've also promised to open up investment opportunities by American corporations in China on things like intellectual rights and copyrights to cover that. I'm not sure what progress they've made, but they've made some progress, and my hope is that the trade talks will improve the economies both in China and the United States. When we don't get along with China, it hurts both of us, not just us, not just China, but also it hurts the United States economically.
Are you optimistic about the relationship between the United States and China? Are we headed in a good direction?
I think in the long term, the American people will see that getting along well with China is a key to our own prosperity and our own peaceful life and our own good life. And I think we have a temporary maybe setback under President Trump, but I can't predict what the next president will do. But I'll continue to use my influence and the influence of the Carter Center to see that we treat China with respect. We deal with their with problems with China in an open fashion and be honest with both sides. And I think the Chinese are very likely to do the same.
But is the former president's optimism justified, or should there be worry? To help answer some of those questions and tell us what's next, we're joined in the studio by Christopher K. Johnson. He is a senior advisor and Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He worked 2 decades in U.S. intelligence and foreign affairs and was senior analyst on China affairs at the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Welcome to Plugged In, sir.
Thank you.
Nice to hear. Okay, now, in terms of dealing with China, I take it, I've read what you've written, that you think that President Trump made a blunder when he got us out of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Why do you believe that?
Well, I think fundamentally most of the challenges we're facing in the bilateral economic and trade relationship with China right now were addressed in some way or another in TPP, especially the key issues with regard to subsidies to state-owned enterprises, issues like forced technology transfer, things with regard to intellectual property rights protection. So the advantage of the agreement was that bilaterally for the United States, a lot of these things were covered. And then the bigger piece of it was a lot of other countries as well. And that always tends to work well with China. When a group of countries come to them with a concern, they tend to be far more responsive.
Do you have any sort of concern looking forward in China? They have a debt diplomacy, what's commonly known as debt diplomacy. Probably the best example is what's going on in Sri Lanka.
Definitely.
There's a huge port there where there's an incredible amount of ships going through the area, and because they owed money to China, they ended up turning over a 99-year lease to China. China now has that port. Bother you?
It should bother all of us, I think, at some level. But I think it's also a very unique case. I mean, it doesn't mean that all of the other investments that are happening under the guise of this Belt and Road Initiative are somehow about some opportunity by China to collect, assets and resources from other countries. The worrying piece is increasingly these countries are getting deeply indebted into China. What sounds like concessionary financing when they're first approached with the deal turns out not to be, and then they can't pay it back. And that does give China leverage with those countries.
But is it only Sri Lanka? I mean, you've got all over North Africa. You've got, they've got a lot of money from China that was lent to these countries, and now they can't pay it back.
Yeah, it's certainly not unique. And I think the bigger problem in Africa really was the provision of monies for infrastructure projects, rail lines, roads, things like this, and the use of exclusively Chinese labor, Chinese engineers, this sort of thing. So the local economy didn't really benefit much, and then of course there are a lot of allegations of corruption in those deals.
And then you add that they're in the U.S. backyard in Nicaragua.
Yes.
Perhaps building another Panama would be essentially a Panama Canal. Mm-hmm. And you've got in the South China Sea, you've got Japan and much of the countries in that region upset because they are creating an island, perhaps a military base.
Right. Certainly in the South China Sea, that's a very worrisome issue. That's an area where, frankly, U.S. diplomacy failed and our policy failed. China managed to accomplish in just under a year what I think if we had shown some resistance when they were more earlier looking into expanding down their facilities in the South China Sea, we would have wound up seeing them do it maybe over 20 years. Instead, they did it in one. In Latin America, I think the issue is much more complicated. It's hard to know what they're doing there, but what we do see them doing is engaging in a lot of investments in electrical power grid infrastructure, things like this, that don't necessarily make economic sense. So it definitely causes us to wonder.
So two-part question. If we had stayed in TPP, could we have addressed those particular issues with TPP or not? And the second thing is President Jimmy Carter has suggested that we sort of kept our United States eye was off the ball as we engaged in all these other wars.
Mm-hmm. Certainly on the first question, I don't think TPP would address these debt diplomacy issues directly. It's really more focused on access to the Chinese market and markets and trade within the region. I think that has to be addressed separately with the affected countries. And really there it's more about promoting awareness, that they understand the deal they're getting in with China, if you will. And on the second piece with President Carter, my own sense is obviously the Chinese have had a lot of strategic breathing room based on our distraction in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and that's allowed them to develop their military to a near peer capability at this point.
So as you sit here, optimistic or worried are you?
In the short term, I'm concerned. I think we are experiencing a definite deterioration in the overall strategic relationship, arguably the worst we've seen in a very long time. These economic and trade frictions really are just a symptom of the broader disease, which is how are we going to get along with each other globally, these two big powers, and are we headed towards something like the so-called Thucydides trap where conflict is inevitable, or are we going to say the world is different now, technology makes everything different, so we can't rely on old-style Cold War tactics in our pursuit of a relationship with China.
And of course, we can't underestimate the need that we have with the United States, with China, with dealing with DPRK, with North Korea.
Absolutely. They're fundamental to that question. Nothing will happen there in terms of getting rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons without Chinese participation and acquiescence.
And of course, if China and the United States continue a trade war, it will disrupt the world economy.
And it already is.
And it already is interrupting it. Enormously
right.
complex, but what a different view President Carter and President Trump have on China.
Most definitely so.
Vastly different view, and where we're headed. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America, and you can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta, and do follow me on Twitter. It's @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.